The rain isn't just falling, it's screaming. It hammers against the thin canvas of Tent 10 with a violence that feels personal. Inside, the air is thick, smelling of damp cedar and the cold sweat of three young girls who should be dreaming of tomorrow's archery lessons. But there is no sleep tonight, only the rhythmic metallic scritch of a zipper. It's slow, deliberate. Lori Lee Farmer is 8 years old. She is small. She is defenseless. She is lying in the dark, her heart kicking against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hears the mud squelch just inches from her head. Then the cold draft hits. The tent flap peels back, and the purple lightning of the Oklahoma sky flashes, revealing a silhouette that shouldn't exist. A man is standing in the opening. He isn't a ghost. He is heavy. He is breathing. He is a predator who has waited weeks for this exact moment of chaos. The thunder drowns out the first gasp of terror. It's a perfect crime scene provided by nature itself. This isn't a movie. This is the last thing Lori Lee will ever see. A shadow taller than the trees, moving toward her with a length of red plastic cord in his grip. The anger you feel right now, hold on to it, because what this man did in the next 10 minutes stayed hidden for 42 years while he mocked the world from the safety of the trees. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. The air in the tent vanishes. It's replaced by the suffocating scent of wet wool and wood smoke. Lori Lee doesn't scream yet. At 8 years old, your brain tries to protect you. It tells you it's a counselor. It tells you it's a dream. But the weight of the man's hand on her shoulder is too heavy for a dream. He smells of the earth, not the clean, fresh earth of a garden, but the rotting, damp floor of a deep ravine. He is a man who has lived in the dirt, and now he is bringing that filth into the only safe space these girls had. The two other girls in the tent, huddled in their own sleeping bags, are paralyzed. They are listening to the sound of his heavy boots on the plywood floor. Each step is a thud that echoes in the pit of their stomachs. Think about the sheer cowardice required to walk into a tent of sleeping children. It makes your blood boil. This wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. The killer moves with a terrifying confidence, as if he owns the woods, the tent, and the lives inside it. He knows the counselors are hundreds of yards away. He knows the storm is his accomplice. He leans down. His breath is hot against the side of Lori's face. In that moment, the innocence of Camp Scott is gone forever. It's replaced by a raw, jagged pain that will eventually tear the state of Oklahoma apart. He isn't looking for money. He isn't looking for food. He is here to fulfill a promise he scrawled in a stolen notebook weeks ago, a promise of blood. He reaches for the first girl. The struggle is brief. The injustice is eternal. The violence isn't clean. It's a messy, brutal collision of a man's cruelty against the fragility of childhood. When he moves with a jagged energy fueled by a sickness that most of us can't even comprehend. He uses the red plastic cord. He uses his hands. He uses the heavy, blunt force of his own rage. Lori Lee and her tent mates are no longer campers. They are victims of a desecration. There is a specific kind of pain in knowing that while this was happening, the rest of the camp was sleeping. Just a few hundred yards away, other girls were dreaming of tomorrow's breakfast, oblivious to the fact that the girl in the tent furthest in the shadows was fighting for her last breath. It's enough to make you want to reach through time and scream. The killer doesn't just take their lives, he treats them like trash. He drags the heavy sleeping bags out into the rain, out into the mud, and away from the shelter of the platform. He leaves them on a trail like discarded luggage. The rain lashes down on their small faces, washing away the evidence, but it can't wash away the sheer evil of the act. He stands there in the downpour, watching. He isn't hurried, he isn't frantic, he is satisfied. Every second he spends in that camp is a middle finger to every parent who trusted the Girl Scouts to keep their children safe. He didn't just kill 3 girls, he killed the very idea of safety in rural America. He left behind a scene so visceral that the first person to find it would never be the same again. The storm begins to break, but the darkness in the Cookson Hills only thickens. The shadow turns away from the 3 bags left in the mud. He walks back toward the tree line, moving with the ease of a predator who knows every root and every rock. He doesn't look back. Why would he? He has done what he came to do. He leaves behind a flashlight. He leaves behind a footprint in the thick red Oklahoma clay. But mostly, he leaves behind a silence that screams. As he disappears into the brush, he becomes a ghost. For the next several decades, he will be the man in the woods, the boogeyman parents use to scare their kids into staying close. But here is the part that should make you stay until the final minute of this story. The man who did this thought he was smarter than the future. He thought the mud and the rain had buried his identity forever. He thought that because a jury couldn't see the truth in 1978, he had won. He was wrong. The most intense part of this nightmare isn't just the night of the attack. It's the 42 years of lies that followed. It's the shock that hit the community when the DNA finally spoke from the grave. Who was the shadow in the rain? And why did it take a lifetime to finally put a name to the monster of Tent 10? The answer is twisted than the storm that covered his tracks. We are going back to the beginning, to the cedar trees and the campfire smoke, to see exactly how this predator marked his prey before he stepped foot in that camp.
Locust Grove, Oklahoma, in the early summer of 1977, was a place that felt protected by the very earth itself. The air didn't just carry the heat, it carried the scent of crushed pine needles, lake water, and the distant, sweet smell of wild hay. This was a world away from the noise of the city, a place where the passage of time was measured by the height of the corn and the shifting colors of the sunset. For the families driving down those winding gravel roads, Camp Scott wasn't just a destination, it was a sanctuary. It was a 400-acre promise that childhood could be adventurous and safe at the exact same time. You could hear the camp before you saw it. The sound of gravel crunching under tires was joined by a chorus of high-pitched greetings and the slamming of station wagon doors. Parents were busy unloading heavy trunks and sleeping bags, their faces filled with a mix of pride and that slight nagging ache that comes with watching a child grow up. The girls were a blur of green uniforms and braided hair, running toward their assigned units with a frantic, joyful energy. There was no reason to look over your shoulder. There was no reason to check the locks on the doors. In 1977, in this pocket of the world, a handshake was a contract, and the woods were a playground, not a hiding place. The counselors stood ready, their smiles genuine and their clipboards full of names. They were the guardians of this temporary kingdom. As the sun beat down on the dusty trails, the very idea of violence felt impossible. It was a foreign concept. Here, the only thing that mattered was who had the best bunk and how soon the first campfire would be lit. The Cookson Hills rise out of the Oklahoma landscape like a jagged wall of green, a vast and ancient terrain that feels indifferent to the world of men. Camp Scott was carved directly into this wilderness, a sprawling 400-acre maze of limestone ridges and deep, shadowed ravines. To a young girl arriving for the first time, it looked like a kingdom from a storybook. There were the tall wooden watchtowers, the shimmering surface of the lake, and the narrow dirt paths that wound through thickets of oak and hickory. It was a place designed for exploration, for learning the names of birds and the way the moss grows on the north side of the trees.
But the beauty of the landscape carried a hidden weight. The camp was isolated, tucked miles away from the nearest main road and the watchful eyes of the local sheriff. The girls were organized into units, clusters of platform tents that sat on wooden decks raised just slightly off the forest floor. These tents weren't cabins, they were canvas skins stretched over wooden frames, offering nothing but a thin layer of fabric between a child and the vast breathing woods outside. The flaps were held shut by simple ties, and the only light came from the moon or the dim beam of a handheld flashlight. The counselors took pride in this ruggedness. They believed that being close to nature built character and resilience. They didn't see the density of the brush as a hazard, but as a classroom. They walked the perimeter with a sense of total ownership, never imagining that the very features that made the camp so special, its distance from society and its thick, shielding foliage, were exactly what a predator would look for. In the bright afternoon sun, the hills felt like a protective embrace. For Lori Lee Farmer, this trip was more than just a summer activity. It was her first time away from the familiar walls of her home, her first real step into the world as an individual. At 8 years old, she carried a sense of wonder that was infectious. She was a girl with a bright, open smile and eyes that seemed to soak up every detail of the Oklahoma sky. She had spent weeks preparing for this, checking her packing list a dozen times and making sure her sleeping bag was rolled just right. To her, Camp Scott was a rite of passage, a chance to prove that she was brave enough to sleep under the stars. She stood on the wooden platform of Tent 10, looking out at the wall of trees that pressed close to the camp's edge. Her pride was visible in the way she moved, claiming her spot on the bunk and organizing her small belongings. She wasn't thinking about the darkness or the distance from her parents. She was thinking about the badges she would earn and the new friends she would make. She had already started a mental list of things to tell her mother and father, small victories of the day that she would eventually pour into a letter home. The tragedy of Lori Lee isn't just in how her life ended, but in the vibrancy of the life that was stolen. She was a child of the heartland, raised with the values of kindness and trust. She walked into those woods with her head held high, believing that every adult was a protector and every stranger was just a friend she hadn't met yet. That innocence was her greatest strength, and in the eyes of the monster watching from the brush, it was her greatest vulnerability. She was the heart of her family, a light that they believed would grow for decades. As the afternoon of June 12th began to fade, the golden light over the Cookson Hills took on a strange, metallic quality. The humidity climbed until the air felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the canvas tops of the tents. The girls finished their evening meals, their voices drifting upward into the canopy, a chorus of laughter that felt eternal. No one noticed the birds falling silent or the way the squirrels retreated deep into the hollows of the oaks. Lori Lee climbed into her bunk in Tent 10, the structure furthest from the light of the counselor's station. She pulled her sleeping bag tight, listening to the first low rumble of thunder echoing from the horizon. It was a distant sound, almost like a warning that the earth was shifting. The counselors moved through the units, tying down flaps and checking zippers, oblivious to the fact that they were sealing the girls into a trap. The sun dipped below the jagged tree line, and with it, the last shred of safety vanished. The storm was coming, but the real danger wasn't the lightning. It was the man waiting for the light to die. Weeks before the first campfire was ever lit, a jagged crack appeared in the safety of Camp Scott. It didn't come from a storm or a broken fence. It came from inside a locked room. A camp counselor returned to her quarters to find the air thick with the smell of intrusion. Her personal belongings, the small comforts she had brought to the woods, were no longer hers. They had been touched, moved, and violated. Her footlocker, a heavy box designed to keep the world out, had been forced open. It wasn't just a theft, there was a focused, cold energy to the mess left behind, as if someone had been searching for the rhythm of her life.
Among the scattered clothes and overturned books lay a piece of paper that froze the blood in her veins. It was a note, scrawled with a jagged, hurried hand. It didn't demand money. It didn't complain about the noise. It carried a promise that felt like a blade pressed against a throat. The words were simple, stark, and impossible to ignore. We are coming to kill 3 girls. It was a direct hit to the heart of the camp's mission. The counselor felt that sudden, cold weight in her stomach, the kind you get when you realize you are being watched by eyes you cannot see. Have you ever felt that sudden prickle on the back of your neck? That internal alarm telling you that something is fundamentally wrong, even when the world looks normal. We've all had those moments where our gut screams at us to run, yet we stay. In the quiet of the Cookson Hills, that note was the first scream. It was a warning shot fired from the shadows, a signal that the camp was no longer a sanctuary, but a target. The words on that scrap of paper were not a plea for help or a random outburst of anger. They were a mathematical certainty. We are coming to kill 3 girls. Think about the precision of that statement. It wasn't "I might" or "I want." It was a collective, cold-blooded declaration of intent. The person who wrote those words had already made peace with the act. They had already visualized the blood, the mud, and the terror. This was a predator marking his territory, letting the inhabitants know that their walls were made of nothing but paper. Does this feel familiar to you? Have you ever looked back at a tragedy and realized the signs were screaming at you from the very start? We often want to believe that evil is impulsive, a sudden flare of madness that no one could have seen coming, but that is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. The truth is often much heavier. The truth is that the monster usually announces himself. He leaves a trail. He tests the locks. He watches to see if anyone is actually paying attention. In the Cookson Hills, the silence that followed the discovery of that note was the most dangerous part of the story. It was the sound of a trap being set. The killer wasn't just planning a crime, he was planning an execution. He was waiting for the camp to fill with the sounds of laughter and the vulnerability of sleep. He had given his warning. He had fulfilled his obligation to the darkness. Now all he had to do was wait for the rain to provide the cover he needed to turn that scrawled promise into a living nightmare. When the note was brought to the attention of the camp leadership, the reaction wasn't one of panic, it was one of dismissal. They looked at the jagged handwriting in the theatrical threat and decided it was a cruel prank. They convinced themselves it was just local boys from the town trying to scare the city girls and the counselors. They wanted to protect the reputation of the camp. They wanted to ensure the summer continued without the shadow of fear hanging over the budget and the enrollment. They chose the comfort of a lie over the jagged edge of the truth. This is the point where the anger starts to build. How many times have we seen safety sacrificed on the altar of convenience? The decision to ignore that note was a death sentence for 3 children who hadn't even arrived yet. It created a false sense of security that allowed the killer to keep moving through the brush, unchallenged and ignored. The authorities didn't increase the patrols. They didn't move the tents closer to the main lodge. They didn't tell the parents that a specific targeted threat had been made against the lives of the campers. They buried the warning in a file and hoped it would go away. But evil doesn't go away just because you refuse to look at it. It grows in the dark. It feeds on your denial. By treating that note as a joke, they gave the killer the most valuable tool he could ask for, the element of surprise. He knew they weren't taking him seriously. He knew the gates were still open. He knew that when he finally stepped out of the trees, the only thing waiting for him would be the unprotected hearts of the innocent. While the counselors went about their daily routines, a set of eyes was locked on the movement of the camp.
The predator wasn't a stranger to these hills. He knew the gaps in the fence. He knew the exact moment the generator hummed to life and the last lantern was extinguished in the units. He was likely sitting in the thicket, mere yards away from the girls' paths, breathing the same air and watching the same sunsets. He was studying the layout of the tents, identifying the one that sat furthest into the gloom, the one where the screams would be muffled by the oak trees. This realization is a heavy weight to carry. The camp wasn't just a location for a crime, it was a stage that had been prepared for weeks. Every girl who stepped off a bus at Camp Scott in June 1977 was walking into a space that had already been claimed by a killer. He had marked the site with his note, and when no one stopped him, he took it as a green light. He was no longer just a man in the woods, he was the owner of the nightmare. The fact that the camp was marked changes everything. It turns a random act of violence into a cold, calculated hunt. It means that the tragedy of Tent 10 wasn't an accident to fate. It was the result of a hunter who had been given every opportunity to walk away, yet chose to stay. He watched the girls arrive. He watched them play. He watched Lori Lee Farmer move her bags into the tent furthest from help. And in the dark of the Cookson Hills, he smiled, knowing his promise was about to be kept. The morning of June 13, 1977, did not arrive with the usual clarity of a summer dawn. Instead, it was a heavy gray birth, born from the remnants of the midnight storm. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and stagnant water, a weight that seemed to press the very breath out of your lungs. The camp was unnaturally quiet. There was no sound of a bugle, no rustle of campers preparing for the day, and no birds singing in the canopy. The world felt frozen, held in a moment of transition that no one was ready to face. The mud was a deep, rust-colored sludge that clung to everything it touched, a physical reminder of the violence of the rain. A young counselor stepped out of her quarters, heading toward the shower house to begin her morning routine. She moved through the gray light, her boots making a rhythmic sucking sound in the red clay. The woods felt different. The trees seemed to lean inward, as if they were trying to hide what had happened in the dark. She walked the familiar path, a trail she had traversed dozens of times, but the atmosphere was heavy with a feeling she couldn't name. It was the feeling of a world that had been fundamentally altered while everyone slept.
As she rounded a bend in the trail, she stopped. The silence of the woods was suddenly a roar in her ears. She wasn't looking at a forest floor anymore. She was looking at something that didn't belong in the natural order of things. The gray light of the morning revealed a shape in the mud that shattered her reality. It was a sight that would end the era of trust in the Oklahoma hills and replace it with a jagged, permanent scar. There, in the middle of the rain-slicked trail, lay three dark shapes. They were sleeping bags, zipped tight and discarded like refuse in the red mud. For a fleeting second, the counselor's brain tried to protect her. She thought it was a prank. She thought the girls had played a joke and fallen asleep outside. But the way the bags were positioned and the absolute stillness of the forms inside told a different story. It was a story of a hunter who didn't care about the dignity of his prey. The mud was splashed across the fabric, and the red clay of Oklahoma had begun to reclaim the bodies. Then she saw the reality. The scream that left her throat wasn't just a sound, it was the death of the camp itself. It was a raw, primal vibration that tore through the trees and reached every corner of the 400-acre property. It was the sound of the world breaking. Lori Lee Farmer and her two tent mates were no longer the vibrant children who had arrived with dreams of badges and songs. They were victims of a brutality so focused and so personal that it defied any logical explanation. The killer had dragged them out of their sanctuary and left them on the path for the world to find. The sight was a desecration. Lori Lee had been beaten and strangled with a savagery that spoke of a deep-seated hatred. The red cord used to end her life was still there, a vivid, plastic reminder of the man who had stood over her in the dark. The rain had washed away the warmth of their bodies, leaving only the cold, hard fact of their absence. The woods were no longer a playground. They were a crime scene that would haunt the state for 40 decades. As the rest of the camp scrambled to respond to that soul-shattering scream, the weight of the injustice began to settle over the hills. The counselors and directors arrived at the trail, their faces turning a ghostly white as they looked down at the mud. The 3 sleeping bags sat like a heavy weight on the conscience of the camp. This was the result of the warning they had ignored. This was the price of calling a death threat a joke. The air felt charged with a sudden frantic energy as the realization set in that a monster was not just nearby, he had been in their very heart. The physical condition of the site was a nightmare for any investigator. The storm that had provided the killer's cover had also acted as his cleanup crew. The torrential rain had blurred the edges of the scene, washing away the fine details that might have led to an immediate arrest. The mud was a chaotic mess of footprints, but many of them belonged to the people who had rushed to help. The crime scene was being contaminated by the very people desperate to solve it. It was a tragedy on top of a tragedy, a series of failures that gave the killer a head start into the thick brush of the Cookson Hills. Every person standing on that trail felt a mixture of terror and a boiling, helpless anger. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was a place of safety, a place where parents sent their daughters to be shielded from the world. Now that shield was shattered. The innocence of the girls in Tent 10 had been met with a level of cruelty that felt almost supernatural in its darkness. The music of the summer had died, replaced by the sound of sirens and the heavy, sobbing breaths of those left behind. The gates of Camp Scott swung shut that morning, and for the first time in its history, they stayed shut. The families raced to the property, their cars screeching into the gravel lots as parents desperate to save their own children pushed past the police tape. The fear was a physical presence, a thick fog that wouldn't lift. A killer had walked into a tent of sleeping children and done the unthinkable. And now he was somewhere in the hills watching the chaos he had created. If this happened in your town, in a place you considered a sanctuary, wouldn't you want to know the truth before the trail went cold? Wouldn't you want to ensure that a predator like this could never walk the streets again? The people of Oklahoma were about to enter a 42-year nightmare of unanswered questions and failed justice. If you believe that no secret should stay buried forever, subscribe now so you are prepared for the next revelation. We are moving into the heart of the manhunt, where the line between a man and a monster began to blur in the shadows of the Cookson Hills. By the time the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation took control of the site, the ground had already become a graveyard of lost opportunities. The red clay was a thick, swallowing soup, hiding whatever clues the killer might have dropped in his retreat. Every investigator standing on that trail knew they were fighting a war against the clock and the weather. The rain hadn't just washed away the footprints, it had scrubbed the very scent from the air, leaving the bloodhounds confused and pacing in circles. It was a failure of the most basic forensic level, and the frustration among the law enforcement was a physical weight. They weren't just looking for a man, they were looking for a shadow that had been given a 12-hour head start. The brutality of the scene at Tent 10 suggested something that the officials were slow to admit. This wasn't a random drifter who had wandered off the highway. This was the work of someone who understood the jagged geography of the Cookson Hills. The killer moved through the brush with a confidence that suggested he didn't need a map or a flashlight. He knew where the ravines dipped and where the oak thickets were dense enough to hide a human body from a passing patrol. He had moved through the camp like he owned the land, and that realization sent a jolt of terror through the community. The search teams pushed out into the surrounding 400 acres, but they felt like they were walking into a trap. The woods were a wall of green, a dense, breathing mass of foliage that seemed to swallow the sound of their voices. Every rustle of a leaf or snap of a twig made a man reach for his sidearm. They weren't just hunting a killer anymore. They were being hunted by the silence of the hills.
As the investigation deepened, one name began to rise from the local gossip and the police files like a ghost coming back to life: Gene Leroy Hart. To the people of Mays County, Hart was a legend, though for all the wrong reasons. He had been a star athlete in high school, a boy who knew the rhythm of the Oklahoma soil better than anyone. But the talent had curdled into something dark. He was a convicted kidnapper and rapist, a man who had already proven he had no respect for the lives of others. More importantly, he was a fugitive. He had escaped from the local jail months earlier and had vanished into the very woods that now held the bodies of 3 young girls. Hart didn't just know the Cookson Hills, he belonged to them. While the police were looking for a man hiding in a house or a car, Hart was living off the land like a predator of the old world. He didn't need a roof for a bed. He knew which berries were safe to eat and which caves stayed dry during a thunderstorm. For months, the authorities had been trying to catch him for his previous crimes, but he had mocked them, slipping through their fingers like water. He had been living as a ghost, a man who didn't exist on any map, but was present in every shadow. The connection was impossible to ignore. A man with a history of violence against women was living in the woods surrounding a girls' camp, and now 3 girls were dead. The narrative was set in the minds of the public. This was the monster they had allowed to roam free. The anger directed at the local law enforcement reached a boiling point. They had let a predator stay in the backyard of the innocent, and now they were paying the price in blood. The mystery of how a man stays hidden in a forest surrounded by hundreds of armed officers and bloodhounds is one that haunts the history of this case. Hart didn't just hide, he thrived in the density of the brush. He moved without making a sound, a skill he had perfected since he was a child. While the search teams were crashing through the undergrowth, making enough noise to be heard for miles, Hart was likely sitting just feet away, tucked into a hollow log or perched on a limestone ledge, watching them pass. He was a master of the environment, and he used the hills as both a shield and a weapon. The searchers began to find what they called nests. These were small, temporary campsites tucked into the most inaccessible parts of the ravines. They found scraps of food, stolen blankets, and the remnants of small fires that had been carefully smothered. In one of these hidden pockets of the forest, they found items that made the hair on their arms stand up. There were photos of women and a pair of glasses that looked suspiciously like they belonged to one of the girls from the camp. It was as if Hart was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, not out of carelessness, but out of a twisted sense of pride. This was the mystery box that the state of Oklahoma couldn't open. How could a local boy turn into a creature of the woods so completely? Some in the community began to whisper that he was being helped by a network of locals who saw him as a victim of the system. This divided the town. To some, he was the mountain man, a folk hero who could outrun the law. To others, he was a child killer who needed to be hunted down like a rabid animal. The ghost was becoming a legend, and the legend was terrifying. The manhunt for Gene Leroy Hart was not just a search, it was a psychological war. Every day that he remained free was a victory for the darkness and a crushing blow to the families of the victims. The bloodhounds, the helicopters, and the heat-seeking technology of the era were all failing against the raw, primitive survival skills of one man. Hart had the ultimate advantage. He didn't fear the woods, and he didn't fear the silence. He was a part of the landscape as much as the oaks and the red clay. The law was a guest in his house, and he was making them look like fools. The fear in the community turned into a fever pitch. Parents in Locust Grove stopped letting their children play in their own yards. Doors were bolted, and shotguns were kept by the bedside. The idea that a man could kill 3 children and then simply dissolved into the trees was a horror that no one knew how to process.
Every time a branch scraped against a window or a dog barked in the distance, people wondered if the ghost of the hills had decided to move from the camp to the town. This is the tension that would define the next 10 months of the investigation. A man who couldn't be caught, a crime that couldn't be forgiven, and a community that was tearing itself apart over the identity of the monster. As we move into the discovery of his final hiding place and the trial that shocked the nation, remember the silence of those hills. Because the truth of what happened in Tent 10 was buried much deeper than anyone realized, and the ghost of Jean Leroy Hart was about to lead the world into a courtroom drama that would leave justice in the dust for 40 years. The search for the killer shifted from the open trails to the jagged, forgotten places where the sun rarely reaches. Deep within the ravines of the Cookson Hills, the search teams began to uncover the physical reality of a man who had become a part of the earth. They found what the locals called nests, small, calculated survival pockets hidden under limestone ledges and inside the hollows of ancient trees. These were not the messy camps of a lost hiker, they were the strategic outposts of a predator. Each site was chosen for its line of sight, allowing the occupant to watch the approach of the law long before they ever got close. The air in these hidden crevices was cold and smelled of damp decay and stale wood smoke. Investigators found scraps of food, stolen blankets, and the remnants of small fires that had been carefully smothered. In one of these hidden pockets of the forest, they found items that made the hair on their arms stand up. There were photos of women and a pair of glasses that looked suspiciously like they belonged to one of the girls from the camp. It was as if Hart was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, not out of carelessness, but out of a twisted sense of pride. This was the mystery box that the state of Oklahoma couldn't open. How could a local boy turn into a creature of the woods so completely? Some in the community began to whisper that he was being helped by a network of locals who saw him as a victim of the system. This divided the town. To some, he was the mountain man, a folk hero who could outrun the law. To others, he was a child killer who needed to be hunted down like a rabid animal. The ghost was becoming a legend, and the legend was terrifying.
As the investigators dug deeper into the filth of the caves, they began to pull out objects that turned a survivalist's camp into a house of horrors. Tucked away in the crevices of the rock were items that did not belong in the wilderness. They found a heavy flashlight, the kind that had been missing from the camp. They found scraps of red plastic cord, the exact same material used to end the lives of the girls in Tent 10. These weren't just tools, they were the physical links between the man in the hills and the blood on the trail. But the most gut-wrenching discovery was the presence of personal items. Among the stolen gear, investigators found a pair of glasses that matched the prescription and style of those worn by one of the victims. They found photos of women, torn from magazines and local newspapers, pinned to the damp walls of the cave like trophies. The sight of these items in such a wretched, dirty environment was a visceral blow to the search teams. It felt as though the killer was keeping a piece of the innocence he had destroyed, a way to relive the terror of that rain-soaked night. The presence of these items destroyed any theory of a random drifter. A drifter doesn't keep a pair of a child's glasses in a cave. A drifter doesn't stay in the same 10-mile radius after committing a triple homicide. This was the work of a man who felt he owned the hills and everything in them. Every object pulled from the dirt added another layer of certainty to the prosecution's case. They had the cord, they had the flashlight, they had the trophies. All they needed now was the man who had left them behind. The forensic centerpiece of the investigation was not found in a cave, but in the red clay just outside the flap of Tent 10. Despite the torrential rain that had blurred so much of the scene, one specific impression had survived in the shelter of the platform. It was a single, clear footprint from a sneaker. The tread was distinct, a pattern that the authorities immediately began to trace. It suggested a person who moved with a light, fast gait, someone who didn't want to be heard. When the investigators compared this print to the evidence found in the survivalists' nests, the pieces began to lock together with a terrifying logic. They found a pair of shoes in one of the hidden camps that matched the tread pattern and the size of the print found at the scene of the crime. These were the shoes of a man who lived on his feet, a man who could navigate the limestone ridges and the muddy ravines without losing his balance. To the prosecution, this was the smoking gun. It put Jean Leroy Hart's feet exactly where the girls had spent their final moments. The clay of Oklahoma had acted like a mold, catching the identity of the killer, even as the rain tried to wash it away. It was a silent witness to the intrusion. For the law enforcement teams, this print was a beacon of hope. They believed they had moved beyond rumors and folklore and into the world of hard, physical proof. They weren't just chasing a ghost anymore. They were chasing a man who left a trail of his identity in the very mud he used for cover. The case was no longer a mystery. It was becoming a trap. By the time the search of the Cookson Hills moved into its final phase, the circumstantial case against the fugitive was a mountain that seemed impossible to climb. The investigators had mapped out his movements, found his DNA and his hair left at the scene, and recovered the items stolen from the victims. The evidence was a jagged, ugly pile of facts that all pointed to the same conclusion. The Mountain Man was not a myth. He was a calculated killer who had used his knowledge of the land to commit an atrocity. The logic was as cold and hard as the limestone in the caves. The motive was present in the history of the man. The opportunity was present in his presence in the woods, and the physical evidence was found in the dirt of his own hiding places. The authorities were confident. They believed that once the man was in a cage, the truth would be undeniable. They didn't realize that the community they were trying to protect was about to be split in two, and that a courtroom in Oklahoma was about to become a place where the facts would be twisted until they were unrecognizable. The air inside the courthouse in Pryor, Oklahoma, was thick enough to choke the life out of a room. It was March of 1979, and the eyes of the entire nation were fixed on a small pocket of the heartland. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a cultural collision. On one side stood the power of the state, represented by investigators in suits who believed they had trapped a monster. On the other was Jean Leroy Hart, a man who had become a symbol of the local struggle against authority. The media had descended like vultures, their cameras and microphones lining the sidewalks, turning a tragedy into a spectacle that felt more like a circus than a search for justice. Inside the walls, the tension was visceral. The local community was deeply divided. There were those who saw Hart as the obvious perpetrator, a man with a violent past who had finally committed the ultimate sin. But there was another, louder group that viewed him as a victim of a system that needed a scapegoat to cover its own failures. They saw the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation as an outside force that had arrived with a predetermined narrative, ready to crush a local man to satisfy the public's demand for an arrest. The families of the three girls sat in the front rows, their faces etched with a grief that no courtroom could ever heal. They were forced to listen to the clinical details of their daughter's final moments, while the crowd outside cheered for the man accused of the crime. It was a scene of profound imbalance. The courtroom had become a battlefield where the facts were often buried beneath the weight of local bias and the roar of the headlines. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave the truth gasping for air. When the defense took the floor, they didn't focus on proving that Jean Leroy Hart was a man of good character. Instead, they focused on the hands of the law. His attorney, Garvin Isaacs, delivered a performance that was as much about theater as it was about law. He looked at the mountain of circumstantial evidence, the glasses, the photos, the red cord found in the caves, and he told the jury it was all too perfect. He planted a seed of doubt that grew into a forest, the idea that the state had framed an innocent man because they were too embarrassed to admit that they had lost the real killer in the woods. The defense argued that the nests found in the Cookson Hills were staged. They suggested that the investigators, under immense pressure to solve the most high-profile murder in Oklahoma history, had taken items from the camp and placed them in the caves to create a trail of breadcrumbs. They highlighted the fact that the evidence was found weeks after the initial search had come up empty. How could hundreds of officers miss a child's glasses in a small cave on the first pass? To the jury, this question was a poison that began to dissolve the prosecution's case. The narrative of the outcast against the machine was incredibly powerful in Mays County. The defense painted Hart as a man of the woods who was being hunted not for what he did, but for who he was. They turned the trial into a referendum on the honesty of the police. By the time they were finished, the focus had shifted away from the evidence of the crime and toward the conduct of the men in suits. The shadow of a frame-up was now the dominant feature of the courtroom, and it was growing longer by the hour. In 1979, the tools of justice were blunt instruments compared to the precision we expect today. There was no DNA testing to provide an absolute answer. Instead, the prosecution relied on a fragile chain of hair samples and footprint analysis. They presented hairs found at the scene that they claimed matched Jean Leroy Hart. They brought in experts to testify about the sneaker prints in the red clay. But in the eyes of a skeptical jury, these were not certainties, they were opinions. And in a capital murder trial, opinions are rarely enough to send a man to his end. The defense tore into the forensic experts with a relentless energy. They pointed out that hair analysis was a subjective science, prone to human error and bias. They argued that the sneaker prints were common and could have belonged to any number of people who frequented the area. Without a smoking gun, without a witness or a direct confession, the prosecution's case began to look like a puzzle with several missing pieces. Every time an investigator hesitated on the stand, the defense pounced, turning a minor inconsistency into a massive failure of proof. The jury was left to navigate a sea of technical jargon and conflicting testimonies. They were asked to decide the fate of a man based on fragments of thread and microscopic slides. For many in that box, the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt felt like an impossible summit to reach. They were being asked to trust the same state officials that the defense had spent weeks painting as corrupt. The chain of evidence was being pulled from both ends, and it was starting to snap under the pressure of a community that was already predisposed to believe the worst about the law. On the day the verdict was to be read, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the only moment of peace in a year of chaos. When the words "not guilty" echoed through the room, the reaction was a violent explosion of emotion. One side of the room erupted in cheers, celebrating what they saw as a victory over a corrupt system. On the other side, the families of the three girls collapsed into a silence that was louder than any shout. To them, the justice system hadn't just failed, it had vanished, leaving them alone with their ghosts in the red clay of Oklahoma. Jean Leroy Hart walked out of that courtroom a free man in the eyes of the law, though he remained in custody for his previous crimes. The state was paralyzed. They had spent millions of dollars and thousands of hours building a case that a local jury had dismantled in a matter of hours. The mountain man had won the legal battle, but the shadow of Tent 10 would follow him until the day he died of a heart attack in prison just months later. He took his secrets to a grave in the very hills where the tragedy occurred, leaving the world to wonder if the real killer had just walked through the front door of the courthouse. Now, you have seen the evidence that was available in 1978. You have heard about the warning in the footlocker, the trophies found in the caves, and the sneaker print in the mud. You have also heard the defense's argument that the state was desperate enough to plant the proof. If you were sitting in that jury box, forced to choose between a mountain of circumstantial facts and the possibility of a police cover-up, what would your conscience tell you? Based only on what was known at the time, do you believe the evidence was enough to convict, or did the state fail to prove its case? Guilty or not guilty? The answer you give defines how you see justice itself.
Leave your thoughts below, because for the families of the lost, the trial has never truly ended. Gene Leroy Hart walked out of that courtroom with a legal victory, but he did not walk into freedom. The state of Oklahoma still held the keys to his life for the crimes he had committed long before that dark night at Camp Scott. He was transported back to the state penitentiary to serve out his previous sentences for kidnapping and rape. The man who had survived for months in the jagged ravines of the Cookson Hills was now confined to a world of concrete and steel. The transition was jarring. To a man who defined himself by his ability to vanish into the brush, the four walls of a cell were a slow and agonizing weight. Inside the prison, Hart carried the aura of a man who had cheated the hangman. He was a celebrity among the inmates, the mountain man who had looked the system in the eye and watched it blink. Yet there was a visible tension in every move. He knew that while a jury had cleared his name, the rest of the world had not. He was surrounded by men who lived by a different code of justice, and he was aware that the shadow of Tent 10 followed him into every corridor and every chowhaw. The silence he had once used as a weapon in the woods was now a heavy shroud. He spent his days in a state of hypervigilance. He was no longer the hunter. He was a man trapped in a cage with his own history. The physical strength he had used to navigate the limestone ridges was now focused on the only thing he had left, his body. He retreated into a routine of exercise, a way to maintain some sense of control in a world where everything else had been taken away. But the hills were far away, and the air inside the walls was thin and stagnant. June 4th, 1979, felt like any other day in the high-security yard of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The heat was beginning to rise, reflecting off the gravel and the chain-link fences. Gene Leroy Hart moved toward the weight pile, a place where he could assert his dominance through raw physical power. He was only 35 years old, a man in the prime of his physical life, known for his stamina and his rugged constitution. There was no indication that his time was running out. He stepped up to the bench, the sun beating down on his shoulders, and began his routine. Without warning, the rhythm of the yard was shattered. Hart didn't scream, and he didn't struggle. He simply collapsed. The weights he had been lifting clattered to the ground, a hollow metallic sound that signaled the end of an era. The man who had outrun bloodhounds and outmaneuvered the state police was suddenly motionless on the hot dirt. The prison guards and medical staff rushed to the scene, their boots kicking up dust as they tried to revive the man who had occupied their thoughts for more than a year. But the spark was gone.
The irony was thick enough to feel. The ghost of the hills, the survivalist who had mocked the elements and the authorities, had been taken down by a sudden, catastrophic failure of his own heart. He died right there in the yard, surrounded by the very walls he had spent his life trying to escape. In an instant, the legal battles, the evidence in the caves, and the questions of the victims' families were frozen in time. The man who held the keys to the mystery was no longer capable of speaking. The heartbeat of the investigation had stopped alongside his own. As news of Hart's death spread across Oklahoma, the vacuum of information was immediately filled with suspicion. People struggled to accept that a man so young and so physically capable could simply drop dead of natural causes. The whispers began in the prison and quickly moved to the streets of Locust Grove. Some believed that the justice the courtroom had failed to provide had been delivered by a fellow inmate with a long memory and a hidden vial of poison. They saw it as a karmic correction, a way for the universe to balance the scales that had been tipped during the trial. Others looked toward the authorities. The theory of a state-sponsored hit began to take root among those who had supported Hart during the trial. They believed that if the state couldn't win in court, they had decided to win in the yard. Rumors of untraceable toxins and staged heart attacks became the primary topic of conversation. The medical examiner's report eventually listed the cause of death as a heart attack, but in the court of public opinion, that answer was far too simple. People wanted a conspiracy to match the magnitude of the crime. The mystery of his death only served to cement his status as a legendary figure. Whether he was a victim of a corrupt system or a killer who had been struck down by divine intervention depended entirely on who you asked. The inconclusive nature of the rumors meant that the case would never truly be closed. Hart had managed to do in death what he had done in life. He had created a narrative that was impossible to prove and impossible to ignore. He had left behind a legacy of doubt that would fester for decades in the Oklahoma heat. The suspect is dead, but the mystery is alive. With the passing of Gene Leroy Hart, the world lost the only person who truly knew what happened inside Tent 10 during that midnight storm. The state stopped looking for other leads, and the families were left with a void that no obituary could fill. The case of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders became a ghost story, a warning told to children about the dangers that wait in the deep woods. But the silence of the grave is not the same thing as the presence of the truth. Over the next 40 years, the Hills would hold on to their secrets, waiting for a time when technology would finally catch up to the darkness. The story didn't end in that prison yard. It only went into a deep, cold sleep. Only those who stay until the end see the truth as it finally emerges from the shadows. Subscribe to ensure you never miss a revelation, because the final chapter of this nightmare wasn't written in 1979. It was written in the blood and the DNA of a new century. After the gates of Camp Scott were locked for the final time in 1977, a different kind of darkness settled over the Cookson Hills. It wasn't the temporary darkness of a storm, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a place that had been abandoned by hope. For the next 4 decades, the structures that once rang with the sounds of summer began a slow, agonizing descent into ruin. The bright green canvas of the tents, including the one where the nightmare began, did not disappear. Instead, it stayed, tethered to the wooden platforms, slowly fraying under the sun and the rain. The fabric grew thin and gray, eventually turning into a rotting skin that clung to the skeletons of the frames. Nature began to reclaim the land with a cold indifference. Vines twisted around the infirmary walls, and weeds pushed through the floorboards of the dining hall. To anyone who dared to hike near the perimeter, the camp looked like a ghost ship frozen in a sea of oak and cedar. The decay was a physical metaphor for the unresolved grief that sat at the heart of the county. Every year that passed without a definitive answer was another layer of moss on the stones, another rusted hinge in the darkness. The camp was no longer a place, it was a scar. The local community tried to look away, but you cannot truly ignore a wound that refuses to heal. The ruins served as a constant reminder that the earth still held the blood of 3 children, and the man accused of taking them had died without a final reckoning. The canvas might have been rotting, but the memory of that June morning remained as sharp as a jagged piece of glass, waiting for someone to finally clear the brush and reveal what was hidden beneath the debris. While the camp crumbled, the Farmer family remained standing. For Lori Lee's parents, the passage of 40 years wasn't a journey towards healing. It was a long, disciplined vigil. They didn't have the luxury of letting the memory decay like the canvas in the woods. They carried the weight of their daughter's absence into every room and every conversation. Their lives became a testament to the endurance of love in the face of absolute injustice. They watched as the headlines faded and the world moved on to newer tragedies, but they refused to let the fire of the investigation go out. They became the keepers of the flame. Every time a new technology emerged or a new investigator took interest in cold cases, the farmers were there, pushing for answers. They didn't want revenge. They wanted the truth to be an undisputed fact of history. The emotional toll of this persistence is impossible to measure. Imagine living 40 years with a hole in your heart that the law refused to patch. They had to endure the sight of the man they believed killed their daughter being treated as a folk hero by some, while they were left to navigate the silence of an empty bedroom. Their vigil was a quiet, powerful defiance. They understood that time is the enemy of evidence, but they also believed that the truth has a way of outlasting the people who try to bury it. They didn't just want a name, they wanted a scientific certainty that would stand long after they were gone. While the world saw a cold case, they saw a daughter who was still waiting for her story to be finished. Their hope was a jagged thing, but it was the only thing that kept the memory of 1010 from being swallowed by the hills. Inside the filing cabinets of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the case of the Girl Scout murders became a ghost. The folders grew yellow, and the ink on the witness statements began to fade. Generations of investigators came and went, each one opening the boxes and feeling the same heavy sense of frustration. They had the items from the caves, they had the profiles, they had the lingering certainty that Jean Leroy Hart was their man. But the acquittal in 1979 created a legal barrier that felt as tall as the limestone ridges. To many, it felt like the killer had won the ultimate game of hide and seek by dying before the science could catch him.
This was the long silence. It was a period where the case was technically open, but practically dead. The leads had dried up, and the people who remembered the details were starting to pass away. The investigation was haunted by the missed opportunities of the past, the contaminated crime scene, the ignored warnings, and the local bias that had clouded the jury's eyes. It was a textbook example of how a case can slip through the cracks of a system that wasn't prepared for a predator of that caliber. Yet, even in the silence, there was a pulse. The evidence, the hair, the tape, the clothing was kept in climate-controlled storage, protected from the rot that was consuming the camp. It was a time capsule of terror, waiting for a generation of scientists who could speak the language of DNA. The investigators knew that as long as those samples existed, the story wasn't over. They were waiting for the day when the ghost of the investigation would finally find its voice and demand to be heard in the light of a new century. The hunger for finality in Mayes County never truly went away. It just went underground. People still whispered about the mountain man in the local diners, and hikers still avoided the overgrown paths leading to the ruins of Camp Scott. There was a deep-seated collective need for the record to be set straight. The acquittal had left a stain on the reputation of the law, and the lack of a confession had left a stain on the soul of the community. As the decades rolled into the 2000s, the question wasn't who did it, but can we finally prove it? This hunger is what eventually forced the vault doors open. The realization that we now possess the keys to unlock the secrets of the past created a new momentum. We no longer have to rely on the subjective opinions of 1970s experts or the biases of a local jury. We have the ability to look at the very building blocks of life and find the signature of a killer. The rotting canvas of the camp might be a symbol of the past, but the evidence remains a bridge to the future. The wait was nearly over. The persistence of the families, the dedication of the cold case units, and the advancement of science were all converging on a single point in time. The truth was about to emerge from the red clay, more than 40 years after the music died in the Cookson Hills. It was time to find out if the man who died in the prison yard was truly the monster of Tent 10, or if the ghost of the real killer was still out there, laughing in the dark. In 1977, the tools used to hunt a killer were primitive, relying more on the human eye than the molecular reality of a crime scene. When the investigators stood in the mud outside Tent 10, they were working in a world of broad strokes and frustrating generalities. Forensic science at the time was largely limited to blood typing, which could exclude a suspect but could never truly name one. If a killer had type A blood, he shared that trait with millions of others. It was a net with holes large enough for a monster to swim through. The microscopic hair comparison used in the trial was even more subjective, based on a technician's ability to spot patterns under a lens. It was a science of similarity, not a science of identity. This was the tragedy of the initial investigation. The state had fragments of the truth, bits of thread, drops of fluid, and strands of hair, but they lacked the linguistic key to read the story those fragments were trying to tell. To a 1970s jury, a hair that looked like the suspect's was merely an opinion, and opinions are easily swayed by a charismatic defense.
The technology of the era was a flickering candle in a massive dark cave. It could show you that something was there, but it couldn't reveal the face of the figure standing in the corner. Because the science was so limited, the case became a war of narratives rather than a presentation of facts. The jury wasn't choosing between DNA profiles. They were choosing between a local man and a state agency. The failure of the old world was its inability to provide an answer that was beyond debate. That failure left 3 families in a limbo that would last for more than 40 decades, waiting for a future where the evidence could finally speak for itself. The bridge between the doubt of the past and the certainty of the present is a technology known as next-generation sequencing. For decades, the evidence from Camp Scott sat in cold storage, considered by many to be too degraded or too contaminated to be of any use. Time, heat, and the humidity of the Ozark Hills had chewed away at the biological samples, leaving behind fragments that traditional DNA testing simply couldn't process. But science eventually caught up to the darkness. This
was the long silence. It was a period where the case was technically open, but practically dead. The leads had dried up, and the people who remembered the details were starting to pass away. The investigation was haunted by the missed opportunities of the past, the contaminated crime scene, the ignored warnings, and the local bias that had clouded the jury's eyes. It was a textbook example of how a case can slip through the cracks of a system that wasn't prepared for a predator of that caliber. Yet, even in the silence, there was a pulse. The evidence, the hair, the tape, the clothing was kept in climate-controlled storage, protected from the rot that was consuming the camp. It was a time capsule of terror, waiting for a generation of scientists who could speak the language of DNA. The investigators knew that as long as those samples existed, the story wasn't over. They were waiting for the day when the ghost of the investigation would finally find its voice and demand to be heard in the light of a new century. The hunger for finality in Mayes County never truly went away. It just went underground. People still whispered about the mountain man in the local diners, and hikers still avoided the overgrown paths leading to the ruins of Camp Scott. There was a deep-seated collective need for the record to be set straight. The acquittal had left a stain on the reputation of the law, and the lack of a confession had left a stain on the soul of the community. As the decades rolled into the 2000s, the question wasn't who did it, but can we finally prove it? This hunger is what eventually forced the vault doors open. The realization that we now possess the keys to unlock the secrets of the past created a new momentum. We no longer have to rely on the subjective opinions of 1970s experts or the biases of a local jury. We have the ability to look at the very building blocks of life and find the signature of a killer. The rotting canvas of the camp might be a symbol of the past, but the evidence remains a bridge to the future. The wait was nearly over. The persistence of the families, the dedication of the cold case units, and the advancement of science were all converging on a single point in time. The truth was about to emerge from the red clay, more than 40 years after the music died in the Cookson Hills. It was time to find out if the man who died in the prison yard was truly the monster of Tent 10, or if the ghost of the real killer was still out there, laughing in the dark. In 1977, the tools used to hunt a killer were primitive, relying more on the human eye than the molecular reality of a crime scene. When the investigators stood in the mud outside Tent 10, they were working in a world of broad strokes and frustrating generalities. Forensic science at the time was largely limited to blood typing, which could exclude a suspect but could never truly name one. If a killer had type A blood, he shared that trait with millions of others. It was a net with holes large enough for a monster to swim through. The microscopic hair comparison used in the trial was even more subjective, based on a technician's ability to spot patterns under a lens. It was a science of similarity, not a science of identity.
This was the tragedy of the initial investigation. The state had fragments of the truth, bits of thread, drops of fluid, and strands of hair, but they lacked the linguistic key to read the story those fragments were trying to tell. To a 1970s jury, a hair that looked like the suspects was merely an opinion, and opinions are easily swayed by a charismatic defense. The technology of the era was a flickering candle in a massive dark cave. It could show you that something was there, but it couldn't reveal the face of the figure standing in the corner. Because the science was so limited, the case became a war of narratives rather than a presentation of facts. The jury wasn't choosing between DNA profiles. They were choosing between a local man and a state agency. The failure of the old world was its inability to provide an answer that was beyond debate. That failure left 3 families in a limbo that would last for more than 40 decades, waiting for a future where the evidence could finally speak for itself. The bridge between the doubt of the past and the certainty of the present is a technology known as next-generation sequencing. For decades, the evidence from Camp Scott sat in cold storage, considered by many to be too degraded or too contaminated to be of any use. Time, heat, and the humidity of the Ozark Hills had chewed away at the biological samples, leaving behind fragments that traditional DNA testing simply couldn't process. But science eventually caught up to the darkness. This new technology doesn't need a perfect, pristine sample. It acts like a master locksmith, able to take shattered pieces of genetic code and reconstruct the entire picture. Think of it as a digital reconstruction of a ghost. Where older methods required a large...
The science of the soul had finally provided an answer that was beyond a reasonable doubt. It wasn't an opinion, and it wasn't a guess. It was a biological match that bridged the gap between a rain-soaked tent in 1977 and a modern laboratory. The truth was no longer a ghost. It was a physical fact. As we move into the final revelation of the results and the closure for the families, remember that justice may be slow and it may be delayed, but when it is powered by the truth of the code, it is absolute. The end of the 40-year shadow was finally here. In 2022, the long, agonizing silence of the Cookson Hills was finally shattered by a scientific hammer blow. The results of the advanced genetic testing were released to the public, and they were as clear as they were devastating. The DNA extracted from the samples preserved since 1977, the materials found at the crime scene, and the items recovered from the survivalists' nests provided a definitive match. The genetic profile belonged to Jean Leroy Hart. This was the moment that 45 years of rumors, folk legends, and legal debates were crushed under the weight of biological reality. The science did not care about the mountain man myth or the claims of a police frame-up. It only cared about the truth written in the blood. The revelation was a moment of profound cosmic correction. For nearly half a century, the question of guilt had been a matter of opinion, a subject for debate in local diners and courtroom hallways. But the new data removed the luxury of doubt. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else were billions to 1. It was a statistical certainty that identified Hart as the presence in Tent 10. The man who had been acquitted by a jury in 1979 had been convicted by his own biology in 2022. The state of Oklahoma finally had the proof they had been seeking since the morning the music died. This wasn't just a technical victory, it was an emotional earthquake. The verdict of the blood proved that the investigators of the past had been right all along. They had found the monster, even if they couldn't convince the world at the time. The hammer of truth had finally fallen, and the sound of its impact echoed through the hills, providing an answer that was as final as the grave. With the release of the DNA results, the legend of Jean Leroy Hart as a misunderstood outcast was permanently dismantled. For decades, a narrative had persisted that Hart was a victim of a corrupt system, a survivalist who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He had been romanticized by some as a figure of resistance against authority, a local boy who was being crushed by a desperate state agency. But the cold, hard data of 2022 acted as an executioner for that myth. It proved that he was not a martyr, he was a calculated predator who used his intimate knowledge of the land to hunt children. The mountain man persona was revealed to be nothing more than a mask for a savage cruelty. The defense's argument of a police frame-up, which had successfully swayed a jury in 1979, was shown to be a masterwork of deception. The items found in the caves, the glasses, the photos, and the red cord were not planted by investigators. They were trophies kept by a man who relished the memory of his crimes. The science proved that Hart had carried the essence of the crime scene with him into his hiding places. The fantasy of his innocence was stripped away, leaving behind the reality of a monster who had hid behind the culture of his community to escape justice. This was the end of the folk hero. The data did not support the image of a man being chased by an unfair law. It supported the image of a man who had violated the ultimate sanctuary of a community. The community that had once cheered his acquittal was now forced to confront the fact that they had celebrated the freedom of a child killer. The myth died in a laboratory, replaced by the sickening realization that the man they thought was a ghost of the hills was actually the architect of their greatest tragedy. The truth had arrived, and it was far darker than any legend. One of the most haunting questions that had lingered over the Camp Scott case was whether Jean Leroy Hart had acted alone. The sheer speed and brutality of the attack in Tent 10 led many to believe that one man could not have committed such an atrocity without assistance. Rumors of accomplices and hidden networks of support had persisted for decades, fueling the idea that a larger conspiracy was at play in the Oklahoma hills. However, the 2022 scientific analysis provided a different answer. The DNA found on the critical pieces of evidence pointed to one singular voice in the dark. It pointed to Hart, and Hart alone. The science was exhaustive. It looked for any trace of another human presence, any genetic signature that didn't belong to the victims or the primary suspect. But the results were consistent. There was no evidence of a second predator. This revelation simplified the narrative, making it even more terrifying. It confirmed that one man, driven by a deep-seated darkness, was capable of inflicting that level of horror. He didn't need a team. He had the cover of the storm and a heart that was devoid of any human empathy. By solidifying Hart's role as the sole perpetrator, the science removed the last hiding place for the mystery. There were no more ghosts to chase and no more shadows to blame. The focus was now squarely on the man who died in the prison yard. He had lived his final months knowing exactly what he had done, taking his secrets to the grave while the world argued about his identity. But the blood had a memory longer than his own. It waited for 45 years to tell the story of a single man who walked into a tent and changed the world forever. The final reckoning for the Girl Scout murders didn't happen in a crowded courtroom, but in the quiet release of a laboratory report. For the Farmer, Milner, and Goose families, the news was a heavy, complicated gift. It didn't bring their daughters back, and it didn't erase the 45 years of empty chairs and unanswered prayers, but it gave them the one thing the legal system had denied them, the absolute truth. They no longer had to wonder if a killer was still walking the streets, and they no longer had to defend the memory of their children against those who doubted the investigation. The weight they had carried since June 13, 1977, was finally set down. As the story of Camp Scott reaches its conclusion, we're left with the reality of how justice operates. It is rarely fast, and it is often messy, but it is persistent. The red clay of Oklahoma eventually gave up its secrets, and the technology of a new century provided the voice that the victims never had. The legacy of Lori Lee, Doris, and Michelle is no longer a ghost story or a cold case. It is a story of endurance, of a family's refusal to forget, and of the power of truth to outlast the people who try to hide it. The music of that summer has been silent for a long time, but the truth is now singing a clear, sharp note.
The story of the mountain man is over. He died in a prison yard, and his myth died in a test tube. All that remains is the memory of 3 girls who deserved a life that was taken by a monster in the woods. Their story serves as a reminder that even in the deepest forest and the darkest storm, the light eventually finds a way in. The mystery of Tent 10 is solved. The shadow has been lifted. Now, finally, the hills of Mayes County can be still. The announcement in 2022 did more than just provide a name. It brought a dawn of finality to a landscape that had been trapped in a permanent twilight for 45 years. When the sheriff stood before the microphones and confirmed that the DNA had spoken, the atmosphere in Mayes County shifted. It was the sound of a heavy, rusted door finally swinging shut. For decades, the Girl Scout murders had been a living thing, a story that breathed and mutated with every new rumor and every failed lead. In an instant, it became a matter of history. The transition from a cold case to a closed case was a physical sensation for those who had lived through the terror of 1977. The weight that lifted was not just the weight of a mystery, but the weight of a collective trauma. The community no longer had to look at the Cookson Hills and wonder if the man responsible was still among them, or if the law had simply failed. The ambiguity that had fed the mountain man legend was evaporated by the heat of scientific certainty. The ruins of Camp Scott, once a place of unresolved horror, could finally be seen for what they were, a tragic monument to 3 lives lost, but no longer a place where a killer's identity remained hidden. Finality is a rare thing in the world of true crime, especially after nearly half a century. It is a quiet, somber victory that does not bring back what was taken, but it restores a sense of order to a chaotic universe. The dawn of this finality meant that the story could finally be told from beginning to end without the jagged edges of what if or maybe. The record was set, the evidence was verified, and the long night of Oklahoma was finally over. At the center of this resolution stood the Farmer family, whose endurance had outlasted the very man who took their daughter. Their victory was not one of vengeance, but one of persistent, unyielding dignity. For 45 years they had refused to let the world look away from the red clay of Tent 10. They had navigated the heartbreak of the 1979 acquittal, the suspicious death of the suspect, and the decades of silence that followed. Their refusal to remain quiet was the true catalyst for the scientific breakthrough. They were the ones who kept the pressure on the state, ensuring that as technology evolved, the samples from 1977 were never forgotten. Their journey is a lesson in the power of memory. While others moved on, the farmers stayed at the gates of justice, demanding an answer that was as absolute as their loss. When the news finally came, it was a validation of a lifetime of grief. It proved that their instincts had been correct and that their daughter's life was worth the 40-year fight. They showed the world that a family's love is a force that can pierce through the thickest brush of a cold case. They didn't just find a killer, they forced the truth to emerge from a grave of bureaucracy and doubt. Finality is a rare thing in the world of true crime, especially after nearly half a century. It is a quiet, somber victory that does not bring back what was taken, but it restores a sense of order to a chaotic universe.
The dawn of this finality meant that the story could finally be told from beginning to end without the jagged edges of what if or maybe. The record was set, the evidence was verified, and the long night of Oklahoma was finally over. At the center of this resolution stood the farmer family, whose endurance had outlasted the very man who took their daughter. Their victory was not one of vengeance, but one of persistent, unyielding dignity. For 45 years they had refused to let the world look away from the red clay of Tent 10. They had navigated the heartbreak of the 1979 acquittal, the suspicious death of the suspect, and the decades of silence that followed. Their refusal to remain quiet was the true catalyst for the scientific breakthrough. They were the ones who kept the pressure on the state, ensuring that as technology evolved, the samples from 1977 were never forgotten. Their journey is a lesson in the power of memory. While others moved on, the farmers stayed at the gates of justice, demanding an answer that was as absolute as their loss. When the news finally came, it was a validation of a lifetime of grief. It proved that their instincts had been correct and that their daughter's life was worth the 40-year fight. They showed the world that a family's love is a force that can pierce through the thickest brush of a cold case. They didn't just find a killer, they forced the truth to emerge from a grave of bureaucracy and doubt. Finality is a rare thing in the world of true crime, especially after nearly half a century. It is a quiet, somber victory that does not bring back what was taken, but it restores a sense of order to a chaotic universe. The dawn of this finality meant that the story could finally be told from beginning to end without the jagged edges of what if or maybe. The record was set, the evidence was verified, and the long night of Oklahoma was finally over. At the center of this resolution stood the farmer family, whose endurance had outlasted the very man who took their daughter. Their victory was not one of vengeance, but one of persistent, unyielding dignity. For 45 years they had refused to let the world look away from the red clay of Tent 10. They had navigated the heartbreak of the 1979 acquittal, the suspicious death of the suspect, and the decades of silence that followed. Their refusal to remain quiet was the true catalyst for the scientific breakthrough. They were the ones who kept the pressure on the state, ensuring that as technology evolved, the samples from 1977 were never forgotten. Their journey is a lesson in the power of memory. While others moved on, the farmers stayed at the gates of justice, demanding an answer that was as absolute as their loss. When the news finally came, it was a validation of a lifetime of grief. It proved that their instincts had been correct and that their daughter's life was worth the 40-year fight. They showed the world that a family's love is a force that can pierce through the thickest brush of a cold case. They didn't just find a killer, they forced the truth to emerge from a grave of bureaucracy and doubt. Finality is a rare thing in the world of true crime, especially after nearly half a century. It is a quiet, somber victory that does not bring back what was taken, but it restores a sense of order to a chaotic universe. The dawn of this finality meant that the story could finally be told from beginning to end without the jagged edges of what if or maybe. The record was set, the evidence was verified, and the long night of Oklahoma was finally over. At the center of this resolution stood the farmer family, whose endurance had outlasted the very man who took their daughter. Their victory was not one of vengeance, but one of persistent, unyielding dignity. For 45 years they had refused to let the world look away from the red clay of Tent 10. They had navigated the heartbreak of the 1979 acquittal, the suspicious death of the suspect, and the decades of silence that followed. Their refusal to remain quiet was the true catalyst for the scientific breakthrough. They were the ones who kept the pressure on the state, ensuring that as technology evolved, the samples from 1977 were never forgotten. Their journey is a lesson in the power of memory. While others moved on, the farmers stayed at the gates of justice, demanding an answer that was as absolute as their loss. When the news finally came, it was a validation of a lifetime of grief. It proved that their instincts had been correct and that their daughter's life was worth the 40-year fight. They showed the world that a family's love is a force that can pierce through the thickest brush of a cold case. They didn't just find a killer, they forced the truth to emerge from a grave of bureaucracy and doubt. Finality is a rare thing in the world of true crime, especially after nearly half a century. It is a quiet, somber victory that does not bring back what was taken, but it restores a sense of order to a chaotic universe. The dawn of this finality meant that the story could finally be told from beginning to end without the jagged edges of what if or maybe. The record was set, the evidence was verified, and the long night of Oklahoma was finally over. At the center of this resolution stood the farmer family, whose endurance had outlasted the